Good evening, everybody. My name is Tineke Ritmeester. I teach in the Women's Studies Department. Come on in. And we are here to give a very warm welcome to Margaret Randall, who will be reading to us this evening, and Barbara Beyer, artist who is sitting at the table there with her beautiful art books. Please take a look because it's very special. Margaret's books are over there, and Jim Johnson is there to sell them to you. Before I start talking a little bit about Margaret, I of course want to thank everybody who made this event possible, and it takes many to bring about such an event. So bear with me when I go through the list. It's all UMD, okay? Word of thanks to our sponsors, it says at the top of my lecture notes. The UMD Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies Department, the CLA Teaching Committee, the Chancellor's Small Grant Committee, the Women's Resource and Action Center, the Multicultural Center, the Elworth International, is it Institute, something like that, LGBTQ Services, and the Commission on Women. And Susanna, did I leave anybody out?
One office is the Office of Diversity and Inclusion.
That's what I meant by the Multicultural Center. Yeah, this is much better what you said. Yes, thank you. Many, many thanks to make Margaret's and Barbara's visit possible. I had a couple of hours to finally kind of synthesize what I was going to tell you about Margaret, but Margaret had just given me a new book that's not in the stores yet, and it has a section in the end called About the Author, which would have been, you know, me about Margaret. And I read it, and it just totally erased whatever I had in my mind, because it's so much better. So I mentioned it to Margaret, and she's okay with me just reading from here because it's all there about Margaret. Margaret Randall is a feminist poet, writer, photographer, and social activist. She's the author of over 100 books. I think we're approaching 130 pretty soon. Born in New York City in 1936, she has lived for extended periods in Albuquerque, New York, Seville, Mexico City, Havana, and Managua. Shorter stays in Peru and North Vietnam were also formative. In the 1960s, with Sergio Mondragon, she founded and co-edited El Corno Emplumado, the Plumed Horn, a bilingual literary journal which for 8 years published some of the most dynamic and meaningful writing of an era. I believe you were the first ones to publish Allen Ginsberg in Spanish, is that correct, in that journal? Robert Cohen took over when Mondragon left the publication in 1968. From 84 through 94, she taught at a number of U.S. universities. Randall was privileged to live among New York's abstract expressionists in the 1950s and the early 60s, participate in the Mexican student movement of 1968, share important years of the Cuban Revolution, 1969 to 1980, the first 4 years of Nicaragua's Sandinista project, 1980 to 1984, and visit North Vietnam during the heroic last months of the US-American War in that country in 1974. Her 4 children, Gregory, Sarah, Jimena, and Anna, have given her 10 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. She has lived with her life companion, the painter and teacher Barbara Beyer, welcome Barbara, for the past 29 years. Upon her return to the United States from Nicaragua in 1984, Randall was ordered to be deported when the U.S. government invoked the 1952 McCarran-Walter Immigration and Nationality Act, judging opinions expressed in some of her books to be, quote, against the good order and happiness of the United States, end quote. The Center for Constitutional Rights, I urge you to look them up on Facebook and befriend them, marvelous institution, defended Randall, and many writers and others joined in an almost 5-year battle for reinstatement of citizenship. She won her case in 1989. And it's in this period I became very interested in Margaret Randall. I remember the fundraising events and readings. In 1990, Randall was awarded the Lillian Hellman and Dashiell Hammett Grant for writers victimized by political repression. In 2004, she was the first recipient of Penn, New Mexico's Dorothy Doyle's Lifetime Achievement Award for writing and human rights activism. They go hand in hand with Margaret. I always say about you, Margaret, that you breathe to write. It's like you write. Otherwise you can breathe, maybe. I don't know. Recent non-fiction books by Randall include To Change the World, My Life in Cuba, the first of a series of books, as it turned out, that have to do with Cuba. More Than Things, Che on My Mind, it is that Che Guevara, and Haydée Santamaria, Cuban revolutionary, she led by Transgression, the subject of tonight's reading. The Unapologetic Life of Margaret Randall is an hour-long documentary by Minneapolis filmmakers Lou Lippold and Pam Colby. Randall's most recent collections of poetry and photographs are, and this is what I was going to say among the things I was going to say, that if you take Margaret's titles of the books, especially the poetry books, but all her titles, and you take them, you have a beautiful poem just by reading the titles. So here are some of the titles. Their Backs to the Sea, My Town, a memoir of Albuquerque, New Mexico, As If the Empty Chair, Poems for the Disappeared, Como si la silla vacía, Poemas para la Desaparecidos, Where Do We Go From Here, Daughter of Lady Jaguar, Shark, The Rhizome as a Field of Broken Bones, and About Little Charlie Lindbergh and Other Poems, all published by a wonderful, wonderful press, Bing's Press. They're on the table there. For more information, please go to her website, margaretrandall.org. And with this, we want to warmly welcome you to the podium, and thanks for being here with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Tineke. Thank you for bringing us to Duluth. We've had a wonderful time here so far. Thank you all for coming. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about a woman who, for me, was one of the most important mentors in my life, and my most recent book about her, Haydée Santamaria, is on the table back there. Haydée was, as I say, a mentor. She was a personal friend. She was the only woman in the history of the Cuban Revolution who took part in absolutely every phase of that struggle. She was in the mountains. She was in the underground in the city. She was in the leadership of the movement. She went to the United States to buy arms from the mafia. She, did all those kinds of things. And so I'm going to ask you to imagine yourself in Cuba at the middle of the 20th century. Haydée was born in 1928, and she grew up on a sugar plantation in the middle of the country. She was not the daughter of the owners of the plantation, but she was also not the daughter of laborers who labored in the fields or in the mills. You probably know that Cuba's a big sugar country, and there are lots of sugar plantations. And Haydée's father was the carpenter, the main carpenter at the mill. So he was a kind of middle level. They lived a little bit better than they lived a lot better actually than the laborers, because they had work all year round. He had work all year round. And the laborers in those years in Cuba only had work 3 months out of the year. They were expected not to eat the other 9 months. But Haydée was one of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children. And she was the oldest. And so I want you to try to imagine what life was like for a woman, a brilliant young woman at that time. I don't know if I guess a few of us remember what the 50s were like in this country. I know most of you don't. But life was very, very hard for women, and their horizons were very limited. Haydée, as I say, was absolutely brilliant. She was inventive, she was curious, she was creative. But she was not expected to go past 6th grade in a one-room country schoolhouse, and that was the extent of her formal education. She actually repeated 6th grade 3 times because she just loved school and she couldn't bear to leave. She did want to go further. She wanted to go to middle school and high school and perhaps university, who knows, but she couldn't. Her family didn't have the money to send her. She did try to go to nursing school, and then when she discovered that she was expected to sleep with a politician in order to go, she desisted. So she just didn't have any more opportunity than that to get an education. And as I say, this was in the middle of the island, very, very small town. Probably, I'd say maybe in those years, 800 or 900 people. I don't think there was a movie theater. Certainly there wasn't a high school. She would have had to go away to a bigger city to go to school, to continue her education. So Haydée, completely unsatisfied with, with the horizons in that place, was expected really to marry. That didn't interest her either at that point. And if not to marry, then become what they called an old maid. And that kind of a woman did sort of charity in the neighborhood, helped people out. She did beautiful embroidery. That was going to be her life. But her younger brother, Abel, to whom she was very, very close, came to Havana in the early 1950s. We think about 51 or 52. It's unclear because nobody was keeping records in those years, and I was unable in my research to determine whether he came in 51 or 52. But he came to Havana. He got a job at the Pontiac dealership, and Batista, the strong man who became dictator of Cuba, who grabbed power in that year in 52, sort of threw the youth, the patriotic youth of Cuba, into a tailspin. They wanted to get rid of him. They wanted to do something about this. This was a man, an army colonel, who in fact had won the presidency in a democratic election some years before, and then had been voted out of office and just decided that that wasn't to his liking, so he took over. A small group of people, of young people, got together, among them Abel and Haydée. And the history books say that Abel brought his sister to Havana to clean and cook for him. I don't think that that was at all true. They had an extraordinary relationship of camaraderie. and political understanding, and he really was the person who politicized her. And he had a friend called Fidel Castro. So Fidel began to frequent this tiny little apartment that Abel rented in Havana. I think the whole apartment probably is not quite as large as from that screen to the table where Tinica is sitting. It was just a very tiny bedroom, a very tiny living room, and an infinitesimal bathroom and kitchen. And that's where the revolutionaries got together throughout 52, trying to figure out what they were going to do to free the country from this tyrant. One of Haydée's first comments, recorded comments about Fidel, oh, that tall guy who smoked a cigar and flicked his ashes all over my clean floor. But clearly she and her brother and others began to believe that he was going to be the person capable of leading a successful revolutionary movement in Cuba. Throughout that year, I would say close to 200 young people began to plan an action. The action actually was planned by Fidel and Abel, who was the second in command, and a couple of other revolutionaries, and none of the rest of the group, which included only two women, Haydée and a woman named Melba Hernandez. They knew nothing about what was going to happen. They simply knew that something was going to happen and that they were going to be enlisted in whatever this thing was. So in 1953, on the 26th of July, which is Carnival in Cuba, and the revolutionaries thought that in Santiago de Cuba, the largest city in the eastern part of the country, the soldiers at the second largest military garrison in the country would be drunk, would have had a great night of partying, and would be sort of laid out in their barracks, and that would be the moment for them to strike. So they got on buses and trains and in cars, and they went to Santiago, only that moment knowing where they were headed, not really knowing what they were going to do. And when they got there, were told that that was the action that was going to take place. They planned to capture this garrison, and by their example, they hoped that the people of Santiago de Cuba would rise up and join them. Well, the operation was a total failure militarily. They were unable to capture the garrison, although they tried. And Haydée's brother and her lover, a man named Boris Santa Coloma, and her brother Abel, were both tortured to death in that action. Some people were shot, some of the revolutionaries were shot, but most of them were tortured to death because Batista said he would torture and kill 10 for every soldier who had been killed, and he carried out his promise. And Fidel and some of the others who were able to escape were captured, and Haydée and Melba were also captured and sent to a woman's prison. Fidel and several of the other men were sent to a male prison. They were given, I think, 4 years or 5 years, the men, but they were out in a couple of years through a general amnesty. And Haydée and Melba were given 7 months. At the trial, where all of the survivors were tried, that's where Fidel decided to represent himself. He had been a law student. He was a lawyer, and some of you may have heard of his famous speech, "History Will Absolve Me," which was in fact his defense, the defense that he himself spoke at the trial. And it was quite an amazing defense because it wasn't just a defense of him as an individual, but it really was a program for what he wanted, and the organization wanted, this fledgling organization wanted a different Cuba to look like. It talked about free education, it talked about free health care, it talked about work for everybody, equal salaries for women, remember, this is 1953, and it talked about the end of racism in Cuba. It talked about women's equality, and it talked about culture and sports being free for every Cuban. And so it was a very important document, and it was a document that made a tremendous impression throughout Latin America, because Cuba was the last country to free itself from Spain at the end of the 19th century, and the first country to free itself from imperialist domination. And so all the other countries looked to Cuba. You know, people thought, wow, this is possible on this little island. Perhaps it's possible for us as well. And so Cuba then became extremely dangerous in the eyes of the United States, because not only was this revolution taking place on an island that's 90 miles off the Florida coast, but it was an example for the rest of the underdeveloped world, especially for the rest of Latin America. So the prisoners were finally amnestied. They were released, and but it became impossible for them to remain in Cuba, and so Fidel and his closest comrades went to Mexico, where they organized and then came back on the Granma, which was a yacht, a leaky old yacht that set sail at the end of 1956. Fidel wanted Haydée to come to Mexico, and she just refused. Haydée was one of these people who never wanted to leave Cuba. She used to say that she was afraid if she went to Mexico, she wouldn't be able to come back. Something would happen, she wouldn't be there. And tragically, in fact, she was in the United States the day of the final victory, on the very last days of December of 1958. The revolution came to power on January 1st of 1959. So Haydée, as I say, was the only woman who had taken part in all these phases of revolutionary struggle. And there were many women who took part in the Cuban Revolution, many, many women, but not necessarily in those years in leadership positions. A lot of women took part in supportive missions, sort of behind the scenes, hiding weaponry, hiding comrades. It wasn't a time when women were really able to take leadership roles, but she in fact did, and a few other women also, like Celia Sanchez, like Vilma Speen, and Mel Bernandez, and a few other women. So when the revolution took power at the beginning of January of '59, what was Haydée going to do? First of all, I need to say that she was severely traumatized by what had happened at Moncada. And in my research, I feel that she really was possessed by depression most of her life. And this was a time when people didn't know really what depression was, you know. People didn't, the word PTSD wasn't used, the post-traumatic stress, people didn't know about those things. So it was very hard to be someone who suffered from depression in those years. And Haydée used to say things like, after Moncada, she said, well, I have to stay alive until the trial, because I have to tell the world what happened to Abel. And then she said, well, now I have to stay alive until we can get Fidel's speech out of prison, sneak it out of prison and print it and distribute it. I have to stay alive for this, I have to stay alive for that. And sort of in that way, she kept going. She kept herself going. At the end of the war, I think, like many, many of the people who had fought, she was not in great shape and exhausted, devastated by the losses of comrades. And Fidel suggested or asked her, and you didn't say no to Fidel, to found and run an arts institution. And this surprised everybody because, as I say, Haydée had a sixth grade education. She had never studied art history. She wasn't an artist herself. She had never even gone to college. And it surprised people because Cuba had a large number of very well-known artists, almost all of them stayed with the revolution, at least in the first years. So it would have been expected that perhaps he would have asked somebody like the great dancer Alicia Alonso, or the great painter Wilfredo Lam, or the great poet Nicolas Guillen to head this arts institution. But he asked Haydée, and it was really a stroke of genius. As you all know, the United States almost immediately launched a blockade against Cuba, a blockade which exists to this day, despite the opening of December of 2014, despite the renovation of relations and so forth. This blockade exists to this day. And it's a blockade that's been tremendously cruel to the Cuban people, because not only has it prevented the Cubans from buying goods in the United States, buying goods, in fact, from other countries under the control of the United States, but it has, and it has meant an infinite number of attacks, military attacks, covert attacks, overt attacks. But it also, it was also a cultural blockade. And the Cubans really have known how important culture is to life in general, how important art is, how important art and culture are to creating a new human being, to having new relationships in society. And of course, the blockade meant that Cuban art and music and literature couldn't get out of the country, and people doing art and literature and music outside the country couldn't get to Cuba and bring their work. So it sort of cut Cuba off from her natural surroundings of other countries with artists and writers and musicians and so forth. So Haydée created something called Casa de las Américas, House of the Americas. She created it just a few months after the victory in 1959. And it remains to this day probably one of the most important cultural institutions in Latin America, if not the world. It's an extraordinary institution. It has a literary contest every year that gives prizes to books in novel, short story, essay, poetry, Brazilian literature, indigenous literature, women's literature. I mean, it's an extraordinary contest. Thousands of people every year, of writers from all over the Spanish-speaking world, send books to it. It's got an enormous art gallery. It's got one of the largest collections of Latin American art in the world. It's got a music department, a department of indigenous studies, women's studies. You know, it just sort of goes on. And she broke through that blockade single-handedly, getting people to come to Cuba, artists from all over the world. Immediately, people like Simone de Beauvoir and Garcia Marquez and, you know, just name them, anybody who was well known in those years. Sartre came to Cuba through Casa de las Américas, and Casa de las Américas sent Cuban artists outside the country. She also ran the institution in a very particular way. You know, when you have a communist country that's ruled by a communist party, it's a very top-down process. It's very centralized, and that has some good points, but it also has a lot of bad points, in my opinion. And she just refused to run Casa that way. She ran it in a very horizontal way. Everybody's opinion was important. She never talked ill about anybody. She might criticize something you had done, but she always made you feel that you were a capable person, a person who could do better. She was extremely open throughout years in which there was repression in Cuba against homosexual artists, against anyone who's sort of considered different. There was a period of really tragic repression from about 69 to 75. They call those now the gray years, the 5 gray years, although many of us think that they were quite a bit darker than gray and quite a bit longer than 5. And She, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Silvio Rodriguez, the Nueva Trova, the New Song movement in Cuba. These were people young musicians whose work wasn't played on the radio in those years, who didn't have jobs because their lyrics were considered too critical of the revolution. She took them in, she gave them jobs, she promoted them. They exist today because of her. And that is the movement that has probably most put the Cuban Revolution on the map in terms of music all these years. So Haydée was that kind of a person. She was a person who carried tremendous sadness inside her. She was sometimes forced to her bed for weeks at a time or days at a time. She couldn't get out of bed because of depression. And yet she managed this institution in a way that continues to this day. If you walk through the doors of Casa de las Américas, you feel her presence, despite the fact that she committed suicide in 1980. She finally just couldn't live any longer and ended it. I first went to Cuba in 1967. I was living in Mexico at the time, and I was editing this magazine that Tinica mentioned, and we were invited to a meeting of poets in January of 1967 to honor the Nicaraguan poet, Rubén Darío, great modernist poet. And this event was put on by Casa de las Américas, and that's the first time that Haydée and I met. And I was, I think, immediately taken by her, as probably everybody who ever knew her was. She made everyone feel that you were her best friend. She had that thing about her where she would talk and you would talk, and she was looking directly at you, and she wouldn't take her eyes off of you. And weeks might pass or months, and if you met up with her again, she would continue, she would remember, she would continue the same conversation. She had that kind of prodigious memory. She really cared about people. I always said, I must write a book about Haydée. But as the years passed, I thought I would do it less and less. I kind of lost my courage because, I was getting older, and I thought, I'm not going to be able to do the research necessary for a book like this. I want to do her justice, and I don't think I can. And one day, about 4 years ago, my partner Barbara said, look, it's now or never. Go to Cuba and do it. And so I did. And I was able to interview lots of people who worked with her, people in her family. Haydée had 2 children, biological children, and adopted, I think, something like a dozen other children from countries where their parents were in prison or had died in the struggle, and she took them in. A niece who I interviewed said, we never knew how many we would be when we sat down at the dinner table. And she was always at the dinner table with her kids. Despite the fact that she was the president of this extraordinary institution, and she was a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And on several occasions, she went to party meetings dressed as a man, because as a protest against the way women were treated in those years in Cuba. She had a lot of imagination and a lot of spunk. And she did things that other people really couldn't have gotten away with, but because of her history, she could. Although I'm sure there were quite a few people who resented her. There were many, many, many people who loved her. In 1980, to commit suicide was just not something that the Cuban Communist Party could understand. The party had an attitude towards suicide very much like the Catholic Church still has. Your life belongs to God, or your life belongs to the revolution, and you have no right to take it. So when Haydée killed herself, it was very problematic for Cuba. People really didn't know what to do, and her body was laid out in a commercial funeral home, which was really a terrible insult for many of us, because she should have been laid out in the in Revolutionary Square, where, you know, the great heroes of the revolution come to rest. So I was there that night. There were probably 3,000 of us in a space that might have held 500. And people were resentful and angry, and it was a very difficult night. As a result, after that, people also didn't know what to do. And when I say people, I mean the leadership of the revolution. People loved Haydée. There was no question about that. But they didn't immediately start naming schools after her, or, you know, writing books about her, or making films about her. It just didn't happen. It was too complicated. It was too problematic. It was too difficult. It's certainly changed in recent years, but for many years it was very painful, and that's one of the things that I wanted to remedy in this book. The book is made up of testimonies by people who worked with her, who knew her, who loved her. It's also made up of anecdotes, some of them personal. The one I like best that involves myself was, looking back, quite funny, but at the time quite uncomfortable for me. When I first moved to Cuba in 1969, at the end of 69, at the beginning of 1970, I got a telephone call from Haydée's secretary, and she says, Haydée wants you to be a judge at the Carnival Queen contest. Every year they elected a Carnival Queen, and her attendance. You can probably imagine, here I am, the budding feminist, not at all happy about being a judge at a beauty contest. Quite miserable, actually, but, you know, Haydée had asked, so I wasn't going to say no, and I had to try to figure out how to reconcile this thing, how to do it, how to get through it, and how to make it okay somehow. So I said yes, okay, I would go. But I wrote a little statement about why I thought that beauty contests didn't belong in revolutions and so forth and so on. I can't really remember what the statement said, but it was something to that effect. I think I thought I was going to assuage my conscience by writing something like that. And I went and I did the thing, and, you know, the young women filed by in their bathing suits and high heels and so forth, and instead of asking them about their favorite popular song, they were asked what they thought of the Vietnam War, you know, and that kind of thing. But it didn't make any difference to me. I still thought it was just awful. And afterwards there was a press conference, and I gave this piece of paper, that I had written this little piece on, to a reporter from the main newspaper, Grandma. And the next day it appeared on the front page. And the next year there was no Carnival Queen contest. And I didn't speak to Haydée privately again for a couple of years, I guess, maybe 2 or 3. And one day we had an opportunity to talk. And the first thing I said to her was, Haydée, why did you do that to me? I have always wanted to know why you sent me when you could have sent some man who would have been just delighted to have judged that contest. And she said, well, I sent you because I knew you would hate it. And I knew you would do something to help us change, and you did. So that was sort of the way she worked, you know. She was very creative about how she managed things, and I hope this book does her justice. So I'll take questions if you want about her or about Cuba. I never really worked at Casa. I did. When you mentioned that To Change the World was my first book about Cuba, it really wasn't. I wrote a book about Cuban women in 1969, 70, 71. It was published in 72. And I interviewed Haydée for that book. So, you know, and then we worked together in the sense that we both moved in the same world, you know. I mean, she was part of the leadership and I was just an ordinary person, but we you know, we saw each other at events, and So I never really worked with her at Casa, but I did spend time with her, and I did, as I say, she was a mentor in the sense that, you know, not in the sense that I ever really studied with her or had a formal relationship with her. We were friends, and I'm sure, as I said before, everybody who knew Haydée must have felt that somehow she was their mentor. You know, she had that kind. I'll tell you one more anecdote about that. When I was doing the research for the book, I was able to see all of her correspondence from the very first moment that she assumed the directorship of Casa de las Américas. And it was extremely interesting because here's this woman who only had a 6th grade education. Her spelling was terrible, her grammar was terrible in the very first letters that she wrote. And there are copies of all of them. And within weeks, her spelling was perfect. And, you know, she really sort of, her learning curve was amazing. But these letters were fascinating to read. There was one of them that I reproduce a piece of it in this book. It really impressed me. It was written by somebody, and it's only signed with a first name. It was a letter written to her, because I saw both sides of the correspondence. It was a woman named Berta, so nobody's really sure who this woman was. I was unable to find out who she was, but I think she may have been somebody from the family of her first lover, the man who died at Moncada. And this woman clearly wanted some favor. It seemed like she wanted to get a family member out of prison. What he had done, I have no idea. But the letter had something of the tone of, she was speaking to Haydée, and she said something like, well, you think you're so important now, you know, back when, you know, we were friends, we were family, you didn't act like this, but now you think you're so important. So Haydée's answer to this woman is extraordinary. She said, you're wrong. You think I'm important now. And I thought, again, sort of imposing my own idea of what was like to be a woman back then in a place like Cuba, I thought the next line was going to be something like, oh, I'm not really important, you know. But no, she said, I've always been important. I was important at Moncada. I was important when I did things to save this country that you have no idea. So no, I'm not particularly any more important now. I've always been important. And so, you know, she had this very clear vision of herself, of her role in the world, of her limitations, and of the limitations of the Cuban Revolution. You know, she often said that she thought women should be free, that we should dress as we wanted and act as we wanted and not be judged on our outward appearance. And yet she said, throughout the whole struggle, I was very, very careful always to dress properly, to dress within the idea of the times, because I knew that if I was seen in the wrong way, I would reflect on all Cuban revolutionary women. So she was thoughtful in that way. She had an amazing sense also of playfulness, and she did things that were just absolutely amazing. After the triumph, she married Armando Hard, another an important member of the Cuban leadership. But before the victory, he was being held in the same prison where she had been held to begin with. And she had been in this prison maybe less than 2 years before herself. So all the guards would have recognized her, everyone would have recognized her. But no, she dressed differently, she changed her hairstyle, and she went to the prison and announced herself as his sister and got in to visit him, you know, and it didn't faze her in the least, and nobody recognized her because she had that kind of sureness about her, you know. She never, there's another story in the book that I won't tell because it's much too involved, but it has to do with a safe house in Santiago de Cuba where she was hiding out with a number of other revolutionaries, and the police came. And she showed them through the house, and she made coffee for them, and she asked them if they didn't want a little more coffee, and wouldn't they like a drink, and, you know, if they'd like to come back, please feel free, and so forth. And the whole time, the house was filled with things that couldn't be discovered. So that was the way she was, you know. She had this absolute confidence, and she made it work.
Were you writing and doing research all the years that you lived there? Was it from 69 to 80?
Yes, I lived there from 69 to 80. I worked at a publishing house for part of the time. I worked for a cultural magazine for the rest of the time. I wrote books and published them and so forth. Not all of them about Cuba, but some of them about Cuba. I raised my 4 children there. My 2 oldest went through undergraduate work there. So, you know, I lived like any Cuban. I did voluntary work. I had a job.
What made you go there back in 69?
Well, that's a long story, and I don't know if we have time for it, but just very briefly, I was involved in the student movement in Mexico in 1968, and suffered a repression due to having been involved in that movement, and had to leave Mexico underground, and so I went to Cuba, so by way of Czechoslovakia.
Oh, wow.
So.
And that went on so long. The first time we went to Cuba was in the 90s, I think, and we went through Cancun.
Mm-hmm. And just now, you know, just a few weeks ago, I guess 2 weeks ago, the rules have finally been changed so that U.S. citizens can go without filling out all the paperwork, as long as they're doing what they call people-to-people research, which basically means talking to people and so forth, and it's quite informal. In fact, my travel agent told me last week that some people feel like a conversation with the bartender at a Varadero hotel is the most illuminating conversation that they could possibly have. So it's gotten a lot easier to go to Cuba, and they may put in flights by the end of this year. The difficult thing that we just got back a couple of weeks ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we're going again in October, and the difficult thing is that Cuba doesn't have the infrastructure to support this influx of people. I mean, the infrastructure is just, it's a country that's been destroyed by the blockade, by the implosion of the socialist world, by so much hardship over more than half a century. So the roads are in terrible condition. There's not enough hotel rooms. There's, you know, the electricity goes off, the water goes out. So there's going to have to be a hard period of adjustment to prepare for this influx of people. Tinica.
You have written a memoir, I would say, about your life in Cuba, and your son also wrote a book about his life in Cuba. You wrote a book about Che Guevara, and now Haydée Santamaria. What else do we have to look forward to in terms of books and poetry? What have you about Cuba?
Well, I wrote a book. My first book about Cuba was Cuban Women Now. It was the first book about Cuban women, and it was really an oral history with a number of women. And then a few years later, I wrote a book called I can't remember the name, but it was another book about women. It was a series of 6 sort of essays that had come from lectures I had about Cuba, not just about women, but one of the essays was about women, one was about the economy, one was about education, healthcare, etc. And then I've written a lot of essays. The book over there called More Than Things has several pieces about Cuba, and it has pieces over a long period of time, sort of my reflections going back over the years, because I've been back many, many times. But books, that would be it. And then my book, To Change the World, which was my memoir that I was going to write with my son, but it turned out that we wrote 2 separate books. And his is quite wonderful, too, and it's available in English online. It's called To Have Been There Then by Margaret Randall. And then, you know, these more recent books. And then I have, I mean, my most recent published book is this one. But in September, also from Duke University Press, is coming a huge bilingual edition of 8 decades of Cuban poetry. I did the selection and all the translations, and so that should be, I think, an important book for those who love poetry, because Cuban poetry is really quite wonderful. So, and then I just finished a book, which I think should be out next year, called Exporting Revolution, Cuba's Global Generosity, because this phrase, exporting revolution, has been used by the U.S. government, by a succession of U.S. governments for years and years to justify all the aggressions against Cuba. But Cuba, in fact, is this tiny country, very poor country, that has had a level of generosity with the rest of the world that's just completely unknown by people outside of Cuba. You know, there are tens of thousands of Cuban doctors and health workers working all over the world. There were 265 Cuban doctors who worked in Liberia and in Sierra Leone, the African countries that suffered the Ebola attack last year, outbreak. There are teachers, thousands and thousands of Cuban teachers. 65 million adults have learned to read and write in the world because of a Cuban adult literacy program that's called Yo Si Puedo. Yes, I can. And then the disaster relief that Cuba has given countries that have suffered earthquakes and mudslides and so forth. I mean, it's just, and they don't go in and come out like other countries that go and offer the aid that's very important, but they go, they address the immediate concerns of a disaster, and then they stay to help the country improve its health system. So the Cubans have done all that kind of thing, as well as fighting in liberation struggles throughout the world, which is, of course, where this phrase comes from, exporting revolution. And, you know, the United States has considered that it's not kosher, that it's against the rules that they invent to support revolutionary movements, but it's perfectly all right to attack a revolution in power. So my book is an attempt to talk about all that, you know, from all angles. So those, I think, are all the books that I've written or am writing or that will come out or have come out about Cuba. Yes, Beth?
You said she was a mentor to you, not in a formal way, but that you gained things from her. Could you name one or two of the things that you have kept with you from her life?
I think her passion was something that was extremely important to me. And she wasn't the first person from whom I learned this. I was fortunate, I've been fortunate to have wonderful mentors throughout my life, women and men who have taught me that passion and that discipline for work. And but, you know, Haydée was certainly one of those people. And in her particular case, her directness, her ability to look at you and listen to you and remember who you were, what you were about, and relate to that in a meaningful way. I mean, I used to see Haydée do this with people who cleaned the floor, with the greatest artists in the world, with people who, you know, were her next door neighbor or somebody selling something on the street, or, you know, she had that love of people and ability to relate to people in a way that I think sometimes, at least I know I often just don't have time or have the inclination not to have time, and then I try to remember her. Also, the way she worked with other people. I don't work with other people anymore. I've become kind of very solitary in my old age because writing is a sort of solitary. I no longer teach. But that capacity, that sort of horizontal work model, I have had periods in my life when I've worked with a great many people, and Nicaragua was one of those times. And I often thought of her, you know, how she would solve a problem, how she would address a problem with a number of people together, instead of saying, well, it's going to be done this way because I say so, you know, really get people's opinions and think about them and hear what people had to say and try to put something together. So it was that kind of thing. And I could probably think of many more things, but those are the ones that come to mind.
When you went back to do the research for this book, and you said you interviewed a lot of people, were you able to interview her children?
Her children tragically were killed in an automobile accident. Her two biological children were killed in 2008. The daughter was driving and the son was in the car, and they were killed instantly in an automobile accident, so I was not able to interview them. And then the other children who she raised have all gone back to their respective countries, so there was no way of, you know, getting in touch with them unless I had made an effort to go to these countries. But I did interview at length a niece who lived with her for 6 years and was there at the time of her death, so lived with her from the age of, I think, 8 to 15, something like that. So she was like a daughter to her. And then I interviewed other members of her family and lots of people about her children. She was said to have been just an extraordinary mother, which was also another thing that just really interested me, because I was really not able to be such an extraordinary mother of my children. I was sort of like many women in my generation who were trying to change the world and work and have children and do it all. And 3 of my 4 children resent that to this day, and they're in their 50s. But she didn't. She was able to spend time with her children, make time for her children, be there for their meals, be there for them in all kinds of ways, and yet do all of these other things that were so extraordinary.
What was Haydée's motivation? As you mentioned, kind of like that continual, like, I'm going to keep living and tell this, but other motivations for continuing this hard work, and your own personal motivation to continue.
Haydée really wanted a different society. I mean, I think from the moment of her childhood, there were stories which are in this book as well about her as a small child, for example, playing with children of color on the plantation and being ostracized for that, but never understanding racism, which was completely rampant in Cuban society at that time and still has not been stamped out. So, you know, it was that innate sense of justice, of feeling that people were equal and needed to be treated equally. She was almost, in some ways, I mean, she believed that very deeply, and she lived to make that happen. But she also, in a way, was, in some ways, was too idealistic. You know, I remember her saying once, well, I don't understand why they charge for the bus. Why don't we just take the bus fare away? Let people ride the bus for free, you know? So, you know, it was just always her wanting to make things easier, to make things better for people, but she really didn't necessarily think about what the economic implications of that would be. She just felt that it should happen, you know? And I think that was her motivation. And then I think after Abel was killed and her first partner, Boris, that was probably, those 2 deaths were probably a tremendous motivation for her. She, I'm sure, felt that she needed to live to do what they were unable to do. And then, you know, in a situation like the Cuban Revolution, as things do get better, and there were many glory years of the Cuban Revolution, the years that I lived there were absolutely wonderful years. You know, I raised my kids in streets that didn't have drugs, where there was no violent crime. You know, I mean, there were some years when, before the blockade took its toll, and the years and years of aggression took their toll, and the poverty, and, you know, before some of the problems that we see today, the Cuban Revolution was eminently successful for many years. And I think that that also motivated her, you know, and I know it motivated me. I mean, and it motivated many of us. The idea that you really can change society, that you really can make a better society with tons of problems. You know, nobody is going to deny, certainly I wouldn't deny, the problems that the Cubans made the errors they made themselves. You know, it wasn't only the United States or only the implosion of the socialist bloc, but there was this real sort of purity of intention, and mostly it was very good. And I think that when you see that, I remember an experience that I tell the story in another book, not in this book, but something that happened to me early on. We used to do voluntary work. Everybody would do voluntary work. And one Friday afternoon, we all went out and harvested potatoes in the green belt around Havana. And that Monday, you know, 2 days later, suddenly there were potatoes, piles of potatoes in the grocery store, so on the ration book, you know. So it seemed very simple, the cause and effect, you know. Here you go and you harvest potatoes, and then you reap the potatoes and you eat the potatoes, you know. And those of us coming from a society like the one that we have here, where everything seems intentionally made more complicated, you know, sort of the idea here is we can't really change things, you know. Don't even try. Or as Trump likes to say, I'll do it for you, you know, I'll take care of everything. So, you know, those of us coming from this kind of a society, that was just breathtaking. And it still is breathtaking to me, in spite of the fact that Cuba today has a tremendous amount of low-level corruption. It has a tremendous amount of bureaucracy. The major accomplishments are still there, the major achievements: free health care, good free education, equal pay for equal work. Those are big achievements, you know. The fact that in spite of all the aggression, those things continue. But the country has huge problems. And in the years that I lived there, you didn't feel that as much. And in the years that Haydée lived, I'm sure she didn't think it was going to turn out the way it's turned out. So I think, you know, all of that is motivation. You see things happening. You think you can make it even better. You know, you invent things. You create things to change people's minds, to change people's values. And it's very exciting. It's definitely motivation enough for a lifetime.
Was really, like, she had this absolute confidence and, like, sureness in herself on the outside, and yet she had this, like, this mental illness that was really wreaking havoc on, like, in herself. So I don't know if you have a comment on that, but that's just something that I was thinking.
Yeah, I don't think that the two are necessarily mutually exclusive. You know, I don't think that one can. I do think she had a kind of mental illness. I don't know. You know, it's possible even that she might have been bipolar. I didn't put this in the book because I have no proof of that, and there's no way of knowing really. I mean, I tried to get medical records; they don't exist. People were not very open to talking about those kinds of things. But I, in fact, believe that when she took her life, it was a very conscious act. She just felt that she couldn't live anymore, and she decided not to. So I don't see her. You mentioned that sort of a confidence on the outside. I think she had that confidence on the inside as well. I don't think that the fact that she suffered from depression meant that she was not a confident person. In her case, I sensed that it was just that life was very, very difficult for her at times. You know, and at times she was able to overcome that. And do extraordinary things, and Casa de las Américas stands as a testament to that. And at other times she wasn't able to. So it's very hard from the viewpoint of 2015, 2016 to put labels on these things. And I tried to be very, very honest in my book. In fact, I'm sure I went further than the Cubans really would have liked me to go, at least in some quarters. But, so I tried to really be forthcoming with what I felt, and I asked people their opinions. But I also didn't want to, make assumptions that I had really no proof or basis to make. It's so different today in the world, not just in Cuba. We know more about depression, we know more about PTSD, and still we know that it's not always treated as it should be. But you know, if you think of the 70s and up to 1980, she killed herself in July of 1980, and then you think of Cuba, or you think of a revolutionary situation where people really aren't supposed to, or at least back then weren't supposed to prioritize their own needs, or, you know, it was for the good of the collective and so forth. It was a very different time. So, and I know she was medicated, and I don't know what it was that she was taking. People said it didn't really help much. There were a series of things that also happened to Haydée in the year before her death that I think perhaps bore some, had some influence on the choice that she made. Her husband left her husband of 20 years. She was in a very serious automobile accident. She was driving, and she was in a terrible accident, and it destroyed her jaw and her face, and she had to be rebuilt. She was in a lot of pain. Her very closest friend, Celia Sanchez, who was the other great woman of the Cuban Revolution, had died of cancer in January of that year. So she lost, you know, someone who was perhaps the only other woman who understood her. So, you know, there were a series of things, and a lot of people said, oh, she did this because her husband left her, or she did this because of the accident. And I don't really think that any of those things were it, but I think, you know, she may have also reached a tipping point that just was too hard to go on.
Do you think that was because she committed suicide, that's why she was not buried in the other burial ground?
No, she was buried in the burial ground where she should have been buried. That was quite interesting. The wake was held at a commercial funeral home instead of her body being on display in the Revolutionary Square. But people's discomfort that night, the discomfort of the Cuban people, the people who were at the wake, was so palpable that the revolutionary leadership got the message, and the next morning her body was brought to the part of Colon Cemetery where she should have been buried, and she was buried there. So the burial was okay, but it was the wake that was problematic for some of us. Yes, Suzanne?
Published this book in Spanish?
It's coming out, it's going to be published in Cuba. It hasn't, no, it's just come out in English, really. It came out in, I guess, September of last year, so it hasn't been that long. It's just been picked up by a publisher in Cuba, and so it'll be out in Cuba probably in a couple of years. Thank you very much.